We all know that the very recent visit to the U.S. just a few days ago by Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen has really put renewed focus on China's ongoing determination to eventually integrate the island into China, whether by peaceful or, if necessary, if push comes to shove, by forceful means. Now, many observers feel China will likely move to either blockade, isolate, or possibly invade Taiwan over the next 3 to 5 years. In response to this threat, the US has joined with Australia, Japan, and India to create an informal Quad, so-called Quad alliance, and with the UK, Australia, and the US have joined to form the AUKUS group, which is focused on building nuclear submarine deterrence in the Indo-Pacific region. So, will these measures be enough to make Xi Jinping think twice before taking drastic action? Well, to answer that question, we hope, possibly, we're very fortunate today to welcome Blake Herzinger, an expert observer of the Indo-Pacific theater, to share his views on this evolving situation. Blake is a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, specializing in China, Southeast Asia, and the Indo-Pacific. He was a lieutenant commander formerly in the U.S. Navy and is currently an Indo-Pacific Command officer in the U.S. Naval Reserve. His particular focus is on the offensive and defensive capabilities of the key players of the region, which of course is so relevant as China makes more threatening gestures toward Taiwan. Blake has in-depth perspectives, I should say, as well as perceptions, I guess, on a potential face-off between China's much expanded Navy, which is the largest in the world now, and the US and allied efforts to counter that Navy. He has appeared on ABC News, Sirius XM Radio, and various Southeast Asian news shows, and has written for Foreign Affairs, US Today, and other publications. He also co-authored a book, Carrier Killer, a detailed study of China's much-touted anti-ship ballistic missiles. Now, Blake currently lives in Singapore, so he's coming to us from halfway around the world, and his time is 10 p.m. local time. So Blake, thanks for staying up a little bit later than usual, and thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much for the very kind introduction, Tyler, and thank you very much to the Chappaqua Library for having me. As the child of booksellers, I grew up in bookstores and libraries, so I can't endorse this project enough, and I'm very happy to be joining you. Thanks again. And I'll just begin with a caveat that all these opinions are my own. They don't represent the American Enterprise Institute or the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, where I also spend a bit of my time, nor do they represent the opinions or positions of the U.S. government or Department of Defense. So with that, the legalese out of the way, we can dive right in. So I'm sure, given this is a foreign policy discussion group, everyone has been watching the last few days as we've seen China undertake a series of military exercises around Taiwan. Now, these are similar but not the same as exercises we saw around Taiwan when former Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited the island to sit down with President Tsai. We've seen a few differences. Obviously, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, did not launch a host of missiles and rockets into the ocean around Taiwan, which is always great for maritime safety. And I know the fishermen always appreciate that when they don't have to worry about, being sunk while they're trying to make a living. But we did see a few different developments, like the Chinese aircraft carrier Shandong get underway and get over to the eastern shores of Taiwan, about 200-300 kilometers offshore, launching jets and helicopters. The PLA Air Force was also flying armed bombers and fighters around over the Taiwan Strait. They crossed the median line, which is something that we saw during the reaction to the Pelosi visit. And in my opinion, we're seeing nothing revolutionary. These are things that the PLA can do. We know they can do them. But what I'm concerned about is that we are seeing the degradation of things like the median line, which for years was observed by both Taiwan and by China. It was the midpoint in the Taiwan Strait that was effectively observed as a border. And the PLA has been acting to effectively erase or render meaningless that dividing line, which brings the two forces into closer and closer contact and increases the likelihood of an accident. And in this kind of tense time, accidents are what will lead to a shooting war, which is what I think all sides would probably rather avoid. Now, it kind of, to go back to a basic principle, how is China arrayed against Taiwan? What is kind of the root cause here? And without going back to the history of the People's Republic of China, but after 1949, when Mao Zedong said, the Chinese people have stood up, really the driving force for the party, their one chief external goal was bringing Taiwan under control of the PRC. It's framed commonly in the news as reunification. Of course, Taiwan's rebuttal to that is that Taipei, or the Republic of China, has never been under control of the People's Republic of China. They've never been the same country. And so this reunification idea is one that Beijing presses very, very commonly, but it is the main reason that the People's Liberation Army exists. It is the core of their training. It is their central reason for being, and they do train towards that. And they've designed a force in many ways designed to invade and forcibly reunify Taiwan with the mainland. Now, the PLA, the modern PLA, does a lot of other things. It is now an increasingly global military, but Taiwan is still the central goal. Now, when you look at kind of where the PLA is arrayed, it is to a large extent arrayed directly across from Taiwan. Large naval bases, Air Force bases. There's a considerable amount of information warfare infrastructure there that is actually, over decades has been conducting a steady state information operation against Taiwan, radio signals, broadcast, etc., attempting to sway the Taiwanese without violence. And that, I think, is a key point, and one that I want to make up front, and I'll come back to it several times. There have been a number of different projections, postulations, windows for when we think Beijing might attack. I don't really ascribe to any of those theories because I still don't believe that a violent invasion is Beijing's first preference. We have lived for decades with the effective understanding that Beijing preferred to bring Taiwan into the fold through peaceful means. We're going to see in the 2024 presidential election in Taiwan which party wins. President Tsai is completing her second term. She can no longer run. So her successor from the DPP will be up against a Kuomintang KMT candidate. And the KMT, traditionally more pro-Beijing, or at least more pro-dialogue, and Beijing views them as a safer bet. Now, one of the kind of lesser observed pieces of what's been happening over the last several weeks is the former KMT president, was visiting China, the first to do so in quite some time, I think ever, actually. So Beijing has to play their cards right now, that they don't overstep and get too intense, because they could push the election to the DPP as opposed to seeing their preferred candidate from the KMT take office. So I think that was part of what was behind the lack of missile launches, maybe slightly less provocative exercise this time. But we did see another effort to kind of break down that idea that Taiwan has some degree of independence, in that Beijing also put to sea a maritime security flotilla, saying that they were going to inspect vessels in the Taiwan Strait. Now, Taiwan said, we will not comply with that. You don't have authority over our shipping lanes or our shipping vessels. Instructed national ships not to comply, and if they were approached by Chinese ships, to call the Taiwan Coast Guard. But it's another example of kind of Beijing trying to push peacefully, still forcefully, but peacefully, to assert authority rather than resorting to force immediately. But again, we've heard it multiple times. I think most recently at the Munich Security Conference, China's foreign minister saying, we reserve the right to reunify by force. We do not renounce violence. So it is something that we always have to consider. Certainly, we don't want to ignore the possibility that Beijing could launch a violent invasion of Taiwan, a peaceful nation. But we do need to consider it in probably two lenses. Yes, there is an external lens where there's a lot of saber rattling. They have undertaken an incredible military buildup over several decades, but also there's a degree of that that's domestic messaging. China is strong. China can reunify. We will be strong enough by 2027 to do this. But really, what does Beijing win if they kill everyone in Taiwan to take the island? And that's really, if we think that we've seen the horrors of war in Ukraine, a violent invasion of Taiwan, which is, really densely populated urban centers and very, very close to the Chinese mainland, the death toll would be extreme. It would be horrible. And if the United States and China were both involved in that conflict, it would be at a scale that we haven't seen in decades. So if we're thinking of military options, what might that look like if Beijing were to undertake a reunification operation? A lot of people kind of cite, maybe a trial balloon that Beijing would seize some of the outlying islands that Taiwan has. And Taiwan actually possesses some islands that are, within visual range of Chinese coast. They're miles away. They're not far at all. I am not particularly persuaded by that, because I think once that happens, Taiwan, which is often criticized for being a bit lackadaisical with defense investment, would have to take the prospect of invasion very seriously. And they would increase defense in a way that would probably make an actual invasion much harder for Beijing. It would also draw a much stronger international reaction. So you would see countries paying a lot more attention to Taiwan. And I think it's probably more in Beijing's interest to keep their powder dry. And if they are going to attempt to take territory from Taiwan, that it's part of a larger invasion campaign. We'd also consider a blockade, which is, technically an act of war. We could see that play out in a number of ways. The maritime security operation that I mentioned might be one way, selectively blockading ships, inspecting, seeing if Beijing was going to allow the ship in or not. And in that way, pressuring Taiwanese industry or foodstuffs or whatever critical supplies they wanted to interdict, or a total blockade in which we would see, the People's Liberation Army Navy surrounding Taiwan and preventing shipping in and out. Now, a blockade is very difficult to maintain, especially with a state that has an ability to defend itself and a strong security partner in the United States. And it would be, if we thought we saw a logistical crunch during COVID, which inconvenienced a lot of the world, some of the world thrown into food security, but most people were mostly inconvenienced. We would see a complete grind to a halt of high-end manufacturing. Basically, anything that involves the most sophisticated semiconductors would stop. And in China's own economy would be devastated by a move like that. So a blockade, although we've seen parts of one practiced, both in the Pelosi response and in the more recent response to the Tsai McCarthy meeting, those were both some aspects of what a blockade might look like. I think it's kind of a middle option that, again, is hard for Beijing to win. It's hard to pressure Taiwan enough to get them to capitulate, and it's hard to sustain. So it leaves us with two more violent options: a massive strike against Taiwan in an attempt to harm Taiwan so much that they capitulate before the United States could intervene. which is by no means a given at this stage. Our policy of strategic ambiguity means we are not pledged to Taiwan's defense. We are pledged to, we consider their security as linked to our own. We will consult with them in the event that their security is threatened, but we are not treaty bound to come to Taiwan's aid. So a massive strike against Taiwan with the goal of getting them to surrender before the United States could decide to intervene, that's one option. It would be, extraordinarily, it would be a catastrophe on a scale that we really have not seen since probably the Second World War, or a total amphibious assault against the island, which again is very limited in several ways. So Taiwan is a very rocky island. There are only so many beaches that actually lend themselves to an amphibious assault. It's very mountainous, so it's actually quite hard to invade. And it's actually not that close. So it's really at the most narrow point, the Taiwan Strait is about 90 miles. That's a long way to cross under fire, which Chinese forces would be, even, just from Taiwan. So, and that's also an option that we would see coming, just like we were able to see from space the Russian army staging on Ukraine's borders for weeks and weeks and weeks. We would see the same in Beijing. We would see reservists being called up. We would see vehicles being taken to maintenance. We would see exercises canceled, and instead people being mobilized for an invasion. So there is no such thing as a surprise invasion of Taiwan. We would see it coming. Taiwan would see it coming. They would have time to prepare. But once that is kind of where we are, there's a few different kind of things that we would expect to probably see. Now, Taiwan being an island and certainly closer to China than to the United States, would be quite difficult to resupply once they're under attack. So really, it is incumbent upon Taiwan and their partners in Washington and elsewhere to lay in the war stocks that they would need to last until they could be resupplied at a later time, which would probably be weeks, if not months. So that's something that you see actually in Taiwan now. They have drastically increased their announced missile stockpiles, what they're trying to build. I believe some assessments put that at almost a 5-time increase, 500% increase in their missile output. And they do build a number of sophisticated anti-ship weapons, surface-to-air missiles, and things of that nature. So we call that maybe, building an iron mountain effectively in Taiwan. And the United States is pressing Taiwan to do things differently. So over decades, really, Taiwan has invested in a high-end military, a lot of prestige platforms, we would call them, quite expensive, high technology. And similarly to Israel, where the United States has cultivated a qualitative military edge that worked for a long time for Taiwan. There was a period of Taiwan-China relations that actually Taiwan thought they were going to reinvade the mainland. Eventually, they were prevailed upon to kind of abandon that idea, but this qualitative military edge idea persisted. And while the PLA was quite weak and very internally focused, that was okay. And Taiwan held enough of a military edge, even though they were far smaller, that they could likely defeat an invasion on their own or with some support from the United States. But as Beijing grew richer, invested in the PLA, they really diminished that edge. So Beijing now has a qualitative and a quantitative edge that Taiwan cannot match. So it leaves Taipei in kind of a quandary. How do you counter something like that? How do you offset Beijing's capabilities? And the US is pressing Taipei to accept an asymmetric strategy in which they kind of develop a large number of expendable platforms, save their most precious capabilities and their people to be able to fight. And that debate is ongoing. It's unsettled, certainly. And the US would certainly be seeking to leverage their own allies in Japan, Philippines, Australia, and elsewhere. We mentioned the Quad. Now, the Quad, because it involves India, is very unlikely to come into play necessarily in a Taiwan scenario directly. So India has got very little interest in a military confrontation with Beijing over Taiwan. They have their own problems with China in the Himalaya, and in the Indian Ocean, and they are not looking for a fight in the East China Sea. Now, inside the Quad, you have the trilateral security dialogue, the US, Japan, Australia. Now, those partners do have probably a bit more to talk about with regard to Taiwan. But if the US isn't treaty bound, and neither are the other members of the trilateral security dialogue to come to Taiwan's aid. And then thinking about Taiwan itself, kind of as I said already, they've really built a force around high-end expensive platforms, which to a degree is still justified because they do need to go to sea and they do need to fly jets to counter things like we've seen over the last few days, these provocations in the strait and above the strait. You need aircraft and ships to do that kind of thing. It also gives the government a certain degree of credibility because they're getting these high-end platforms from their key security partner in Washington. But without that qualitative edge or quantitative edge, Taiwan needs to think about ways to use its force and husband its forces responsibly. And so they have they had a concept called the overall defense concept. It was conceptualized by Admiral Lee See-min, who was former chief of the general staff. So 2017, he kind of rolled out this plan that was going to push Taiwan into a more asymmetric posture. And he, kind of a tagline for this was a large amount of small things, or a large number of small things. Thinking about unmanned technologies, sea mines, and the types of things that you can lose without losing people, but still degrade larger, more expensive platforms like the PRC possesses. Now, for 3 years, they sort of made progress toward that. The U.S. was very excited about that. You saw a lot of congressmen, in particular, endorsing that plan. But after Admiral Lee left service, that plan was kind of put on the shelf, and you saw Taiwan developing different capabilities, missiles that could threaten the mainland, which was something they hadn't done before, and kind of moving away from the ODC. So you see a bit of jostling now, the U.S. trying to convince Taiwan back to that path that the U.S. likes. Because they, generally see it as a more effective way of fighting that war and deterring an invasion or defeating an invasion. But again, that's a conversation that's not finished. Now, how do U.S.-China relations play into this? We were sort of talking before the show. The one area of bipartisan agreement is China, and unfortunately, our own dialogue is getting very, very heated. We're getting a lot of voices that may or may not know much about U.S.-China relations or China or much about Asia. And, I get concerned, and I know others are, that we may be pursuing kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy here, in that we're making conflict with the PRC more likely over something that they would actually probably rather not fight about. Just because Xi Jinping says to the army, I want you to be capable of invading Taiwan in 2027, it would be kind of silly for Xi Jinping to announce that he's going to invade Taiwan in 2027, because then obviously we would be ready for that, in theory. So we have to think about things, what is for a domestic audience, what is for an external audience. Does it make sense for Beijing to slit its economy's own throat over Taiwan, which is absolutely what would happen? The economic consequences to China would probably be greater than anywhere else. The consequences that Russia has suffered would be a drop in the bucket compared to what Beijing would suffer over an invasion of Taiwan. It would just, as a production economy and export economy without any resources, it would be totally different. So we saw Russia kicked out of SWIFT. We saw Russian, individuals sanctioned. But Russian commodities are still moving because you need those commodities in the market. Not all of them, but they're not cut off. They're still exporting. China would be killing its own export market, even if you just considered the export of semiconductors from Taiwan. The amount of cross-strait trade is actually quite vast. U.S.-China trade, I believe, was an all-time high in the last year. So you're still seeing a lot of indicators that it wouldn't really be in China's interest. And we can argue whether, how Beijing views its own interests. Certainly Taiwan is its number one core interest. But, what do you do with 1.4 billion people when no one has jobs and no one can make money, and then all of a sudden there's no food either. So there's a lot to think about there, and there's a lot of, I think there's more room for a bit of pragmatic discussion and probably a bit more of the economic conversation as opposed to just the defense conversation. We're seeing US-China competition kind of bleeding into all these different spheres. Defense is one thing. We're seeing, just during this last exercise around Taiwan, the Nimitz strike group was near or likely near the Shandong, but that's because they're going to the Philippines for an exercise. So these militaries are in close proximity. There's a lot going on. Economic competition is one where we probably in the US don't appreciate as much how eroded our position is in the region and how strong the PRCs is because they've worked hard to build that. And we have kind of withdrawn from trade. We're not a free trading nation at this time. Neither party endorses free trade. We pulled out of the TPP, which the region was very upset by. And China is surging forward on regional trade agreements. Most of Asia, whether it's East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, most people want, a better life for themselves or for their families. They don't want a war. There might still be one, but generally people are happy with a government that can deliver on prosperity. They want investment, and in a lot of cases, they're not really on board with confrontation of China because they're willing to kind of endure a bad neighbor to have access to a market or to, get trade deals. So something worth thinking about when you think about the region. But, how has China used its extraordinary economic wealth over the last several decades or surging economy? They've leveraged it into the world's largest navy. That building campaign began in the 20th century, in the 1980s, really, and then really started moving in the later 90s. And then after 2000, really leapt. And they outbuild the US tremendously. The PRC has most of the world's busiest ports, or a majority of the top 10 world's busiest ports. They have a almost unrivaled shipbuilding industry. The US is basically completely out of the shipbuilding game, so we struggle. We have kind of the Royal Navy disease at this point. We're building a smaller number of ships, and it costs more to maintain them because we don't have the infrastructure to do it. And they're innovating. The Shandong was a Russian Hulk they bought out of Ukraine and converted into a ship that can sail in 2023. It's actually kind of an engineering miracle. When you look at the one ship that the Russians are able to get underway from that class, if they get it underway and the boilers don't explode, or a plane doesn't crash, or it doesn't lose propulsion, it's a miracle. So what they've done is pretty amazing. They're building nuclear submarines. They're building nuclear armed submarines. They're building domestic aircraft carriers with EMALS technology that the United States has struggled to field. So we're seeing a lot. We're seeing the PLAN in the Persian Gulf as well. That's something that a colleague of mine at AEI and I wrote about for the Washington Institute. And I saw it on a deployment as a reservist in 2019. Chinese ships in the Gulf of Aden, in the Arabian Sea, and in the Persian Gulf. It's a common sight. And we're seeing competition with our traditional partners there in the UAE. We're seeing Chinese ships trying to pull into Israel. The Saudis are increasing and deepening their partnership with the PRC. And so there's a lot happening, and it's probably wise to keep an eye on. And then in my work at USSC, we're thinking a lot about AUKUS, so the Australia, UK, US kind of trilateral, which recently announced Australia's intent to purchase a newly developed class of nuclear-propelled submarine, the AUKUS class. In the interim, until that submarine is fielded, which will probably be, it'll be over a decade from now when those start rolling off the line. In the 2030s, they'll begin to buy Virginia-class submarines from the United States. We'll likely have combined crews with US sailors and Australian sailors operating those submarines out of Western Australia, out of Fremantle. And the US and the Royal Navy from the UK will also be basing submarines out of Fremantle, operating in the region. But, if you're really thinking about a 2027 window, which again, I am not, that plan really won't start to bite until well after that point. So we're talking about long-term investments in partnerships to balance kind of this overwhelming Chinese power and kind of revisionist urge, excuse me, it's getting late, that we see from Beijing to rewrite the rules that the region has become, the rules under which the region has prospered, since really in the post-war era. And Beijing is interested in changing those rules to accommodate its interests, and sees itself as the center of that region and would like to see the United States leave. So, we're in for rougher waters ahead. We haven't seen the worst of it, I'm sure. But I'm not, a sky is falling type of a guy. I don't think we're going to see a war in Taiwan in 2027 or before, unless it's through a drastic miscalculation or an accident. I wouldn't say it's the PRC's plan to do so. But I think that's probably close to a half an hour of you listening to me yammer on. So if we want to do some questions or open up the floor, that worked for me. So thanks all for listening to that, and hopefully it was useful.
Thank you, Blake. That's terrific. Great summary. Let me ask the first question if I could. There's a lot going on in the area which would tend to suggest that some of the key players are continuing increasingly to take China's threats very seriously. And most of them have been positive, I would think, from a US standpoint. For example, we've got South Korea actually having somewhat of a rapprochement with Japan. We've got the Philippines deciding that, gee, maybe the Americans aren't so bad after all, and we will be, well, halfway happy to open up I guess, allow them to use some of the bases that they had used historically in the northern part of the Philippines. And you've got Japan making a very significant decision to remilitarize. It sounds a little dramatic, but I mean, that's in effect what's going on. So could you comment on some of those shifts in regional, activity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to, by saying I don't think that we're sitting on the precipice of war, I don't want to diminish the fact that I think the region is paying attention, and the militarization of China is something to watch. And it is, generally countries don't build the world's largest navy without trying to use it. You don't generally invest, untold trillions in a military that you don't plan to use. And so I guess, especially countries like Japan are wary of that. We saw Prime Minister Kishida here in Singapore last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Earlier this year? Losing track of time. And he actually made the comment that he was very concerned that today it could be Ukraine and tomorrow it would be East Asia. So this idea that might makes right, the idea that it's okay to invade a neighbor. The contagion there is the thing that Asia is worried about. They're concerned that Beijing would be encouraged by a successful invasion of Ukraine and seek to resolve its issues with violence. Now, Philippines, obviously, we saw over 5 years of Rodrigo Duterte, a very shaky time for the alliance. President Marcos has been more enthusiastic, opening up more EDCA sites, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which I believe we had five sites open before that or intended to be open, and adding another 4 was positive. Philippines is also acquiring some significant anti-ship cruise missiles from India, interestingly co-developed with the Russians. But that's something that Philippines has been keen to acquire for some time, and Vietnam is also looking at something similar. Vietnam has acquired 6 Russian-built Kilo submarines, a very sophisticated modern diesel submarine. The Korea-Japan rapprochement is very, very encouraging. I think it is going to be a struggle for South Korea, which has kind of banged that drum over wartime issues for so long. They're going to have a hard time selling that domestically. So I don't think we've quite seen the end of that problem, but it is encouraging to see those partners coming back together after a few very shaky years that saw things like, harassment of ships by aircraft and, skipping visits and that sort of thing. But, South Korea has their own problem on their northern border. And we're seeing some pretty disturbing developments there, even with South Korea, they've made very public comments about willingness to seek a nuclear weapon if they don't feel reassured enough by their security partners in Washington. They've also kind of revamped plans to conduct decapitation strikes against the North Korean regime, or attacking nuclear weapons before they could be launched, which creates kind of a use-lose dilemma for Kim Jong-un. Do I wait and potentially lose these nuclear weapons or my life, or do I launch them sooner than I would normally? So by no means should we consider the Indo-Pacific as an area where US-China or China-Taiwan is the only issue we're dealing with. We are still dealing with, Korean Peninsula that exists in a state of war under armistice. One nuclear power on the Korean Peninsula and the potential nuclearization of another. There's still a lot happening, and that's kind of leaving out India as well, which has issues obviously with neighboring Pakistan, significant issues with China. The border crisis that saw 24 Indian soldiers killed was a huge deal for India. I know in the United States, some people, even in Washington, still say, well, India may go back to Beijing and they'll seek to repair that relationship. And I think that ship has sailed. No one that I know in India would endorse that view. Having seen military funerals all over the country, seeing, dead soldiers sent back from the border, killed by the Chinese with, effectively clubs. Delhi is not interested in a rapprochement, and also probably not able, because domestically that would not be popular in the least bit. So yeah, the region is recognizing what Beijing has been doing. I wouldn't say the region is particularly interested in being involved in a Taiwan contingency, other than a few key partners. But they are concerned with what Beijing has done and what they might do in the future.
Any questions from the panel? Don, perhaps.
I have one, Blake, and it has to do with the opportunity that it seems the United States missed when it was being invited a few years back to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and turned that down. This was after Trump, I guess, about the same time Trump was canceling the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it seems that the United States is really not doing things that make it more friendly towards China. So I wonder what your thoughts were on that. That seemed to me an opportunity that we missed.
Well, I guess it's a great question, Don, and I wouldn't consider myself a political economist, but the AIIB at that time, I think that was actually the Obama administration, if I'm not wrong, would have been a pretty tough sell. Chinese investment has traditionally been different. We're also, we're involved in other kind of institutions anyway. And there was really, I think at that time, and certainly more so now, reticence to be involved in anything that involved Chinese lending because their practices were a bit different. Although AIIB was seeking kind of to employ more best practices. But as we've seen kind of with things like the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese investment has not necessarily gone places where it was useful. I don't actually go in on the debt trap diplomacy thing too much because I don't think that there is a ton there, but it did create immense debt for a lot of countries that they're unable to service for projects that don't deliver. Pakistan, you're talking about building a huge amount of power generation infrastructure when something like 10% of Pakistan pays their power bills. So how are you ever going to pay that off? You won't. the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka that, doesn't deliver, the airport in Sri Lanka that doesn't do anything. And seeing now countries in distress with these kind of white elephant projects that they're unable to use. But China was effectively exporting, capacity. They had all these people and they had all this construction capacity, and they couldn't just keep building empty cities in China. So they went and built things everywhere else. But they're now having to issue a large amount of debt relief to those partners. And like I said at the beginning, unfortunately, we don't have a free trade party in the United States anymore. So if it hadn't been Trump that pulled us out of TPP, it would have been Clinton. There was no candidate that ran on TPP, despite having set it up really or supported it as Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton ran against it as a candidate. And so, watching from Asia, most of Asia is just incredibly dismayed by that. The CPTPP has been somewhat successful. We see countries like the UK joining, but that effort has effectively been led by Japan and other interested parties. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, is usually talked about as if it's a Chinese project. Actually, it's a Southeast Asian project that China is now obviously the largest economy inside of it, and we're outside of it. So we don't have to be in every free trade agreement, but we are increasingly outside of the places where the economic rules of this region are going to be written. And that's not going to pay off for, a maritime trading state that really succeeded on free trade. Free trade and sailors' rights is kind of as old as it gets in terms of an economic philosophy for the United States. And we don't do free trade, and we don't build ships, and we're not a shipping power. So for a maritime nation, that's troubling.
I guess my question was a little bit broader than that, in the sense that, are we missing other opportunities to show friendship towards China? It's instead of just being on the offensive.
Yeah, well, I think that's a two-way street. I don't think China's done a lot to be to put itself out there as a friend in the last few decades. An immense transfer of wealth via a unrestricted hacking campaign against U.S. industry, effectively economic warfare against the United States for 3 decades. That doesn't do a lot to engender positive relations, unfortunately. So I don't necessarily, as critical as I can be about U.S. policy in Asia and sometimes our China policy, I don't put the onus on the United States at this point for not being super interested in productive partnership with Beijing, because they basically shut it all down. So they're only going to participate where it suits Beijing, when it suits them to weaponize it or turn it against or turn off the tap or not pick up the phone, they don't. So it's really hard to find confidence building space with a regime like that.
So I have a question from an audience. So the question is, the PLA Army and Navy haven't fought a serious war in decades. So they have few field officers with any experience. How do they expect to gain experience to be able to conduct a difficult military operation, invasion of a distant, hostile, defended target across a water barrier?
Yeah, it's a great question, but I guess if you think about it, no one else does either. The most experienced armies in the world right now are the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. It's not the United States. We just fought two-decade counterinsurgency operations. A lot of those people have either retired or quit. So, we're not necessarily in the high-end warfighting experience game ourselves. Unfortunately, if there was an invasion of Taiwan and the United States intervened, we would both be learning a lot of really terrible lessons on the fly. Obviously, the United States is a more professional military. Our non-commissioned officer corps is something that Beijing does not have at all. They have, for decades, tried to build one, and they're not very good at it for a number of reasons, but one being that, a centralized top-down military has a hard time developing NCOs like the United States does that are capable of leading or taking the initiative. That's a huge weak point for the Chinese that I don't think they'll fix. So yeah, the last war they did fight, they invaded Vietnam and promptly, got the rears kicked, and then later retreated, claiming victory. But it's a different PLA now in 2023. In some ways, in other ways, they're probably still not great. So yeah, but the experience one, it's a common question and kind of a poke at the Chinese. But when you think about the kind of war that would be, we haven't fought one like that either. At that scale or with those tools that we would be using.
So I guess a follow-up question on that is that you have this military force. So is there, with in a way, you were somewhat talking about this, who are building capacity and yet they have no war. So how do you control, presumably, people who are being prepared for war and the testosterone, as they would put it, that goes with that, to be able to control that? And, maybe likewise for our soldiers.
Well, we're both inclusive and diverse militaries at this point, so it's not just testosterone driven, I'll say that. But it is, it is a question that, hey, you have an enormous force under arms. What are you going to plan to do with that? Right now, we're seeing it present all over the world, just like ours is. And I think that is something we need to expect for a country like China, that is a rising or arguably already risen great power, a nuclear state with global interests. We will see a global military, just like the United States developed, or any other state in that position. So on one hand, we should kind of not be that surprised at what we're seeing. But obviously the other things that we should be concerned about are the fact that they're developing and training toward, a violent invasion of a neighbor. My book on China's anti-ship ballistic missile program, that's a program designed to sink U.S. aircraft carriers to keep them from aiding Taiwan. I mean, that's why they built them. They watched us dismantle the Iraqi military in the early 1990s. They watched us dismantle Slobodan Milosevic's regime from the air. And they said, what can we build that doesn't cost as much as a 500-ship Navy that could threaten, an aircraft carrier? We don't want U.S. carriers sailing near the Taiwan Strait again, like we did in the third Taiwan Strait crisis. What could we do? So they built these missiles. They're building larger amphibious assault ships. They've built, the world's largest ballistic missile force, world's largest Navy. And so, yeah, you would probably expect them to maybe use those at some point. The other thing that we don't talk about very often, some people are working on this, but that stuff also gets really expensive. The average Chinese ship is something like 2 decades newer than most US ships. And we're seeing right now the incredible cost of maintaining a military that big. China hasn't got there yet, but they're going to. And all this stuff will start getting more and more expensive to maintain at a time when China's economy is slowing and arguably showing more cracks than it has in a very, very long time. So we're going to see Beijing learn some lessons about the cost of sustaining a force like that. And if they use it, it's probably not something they could replace. So that's a trade-off. If you look at an invasion of Taiwan, is Xi Jinping going to trade this 500-ship Navy for Taiwan when he'd probably never get a Navy like that again? Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't, but it's kind of one of those pieces of his calculus that are probably happening as we speak.
Blake, a question. Over the last month, Xi Jinping has enhanced his global image, as you are well aware, by brokering this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That's quite an accomplishment. I'm sure he's feeling very self-satisfied. Do you think, though, that his having enhanced his image perhaps as a global diplomat, to kind of stretch the point, that this decreases the probability or the possibility that he will be increasingly assertive and confrontational vis-a-vis Taiwan, and might think, gee, I'm in my new status as a world peacemaker, it would be unseemly to perhaps attack Taiwan. You know, just as a general observation. Does that make any sense to you, or?
I don't think that that would be how he would conceptualize that.
Okay.
Because Xi Jinping and all Chinese leaders before him view Taiwan as an internal matter. You know, what would the United States do if Florida seceded? Right. That's how they try and frame it. What would they do if Hawaii wanted to be its own country? That's how Beijing generally frames that. So they don't view it like we do, that it's an invasion of a state. They would view that as a police action. You know, effectively the Civil War, right? Preventing secession. And that's how they always kind of bang that drum, the anti-secessionist idea, because they certainly don't observe Taiwan as an independent entity. It's a rogue province in their view. But I don't think this is a big, you know, philosophical change or pivot point for Xi Jinping. He is looking to bolster his image, but he is still the head of a government that is very much aimed toward reunification. And he's very keen to do that. He's said multiple times over his last 2 terms and now in his third, that, you know, Taiwan is still a core interest of the PRC, and he wants to see that happen, and has told, you know, the PLA to be ready again by, you know, to be ready to do that. So yeah, I wouldn't sadly, I wouldn't be that encouraged. I wouldn't imagine any encouraging linkage between those two things. Although, you know, the Iran Saudi agreement is pretty amazing, and the United States certainly could never break that agreement. But we also have to kind of take that with a grain of salt. How much are things going to change between Riyadh and Tehran? Probably not too much. There's still a war in Yemen that both sides have proxies fighting. So we'll see kind of how far that goes.
Yeah. Now, while we're on diplomacy, you don't hear much about wolf diplomacy anymore. Remember a few years ago, we were getting, was it Wang Yi, who would, you know, pound the table almost like Khrushchev back in the day, being furious with the rest of the world and so forth. Is he still around, or Wang Yi?
So the wolf warrior thing, warrior diplomacy, and if you ever want to have an interesting insight into the origins of that term, I highly recommend watching the movies. But it's kind of one of those things that will turn on and off, you know, as it suits. Right now, it's very much not in Xi Jinping's interest to have, you know, it's better to have it quiet. Again, kind of going back to the Taiwan election, he wants to be, you know, he wants their guys or the people they like better to have a better chance in the election. It's a rough economy at home. They've just dealt with visible protests. They're just coming out of COVID. They're struggling to recover. It's not a great time for him to have conflict with the United States. And so that rhetoric gets toned down during times like this. It's less intense. If we see China's economy stabilizing or improving, things like that, you know, we could see it ticking back up. But that's kind of you look at that as maybe those diplomats are really speaking to an audience of one. You know, they're kind of, hey, Xi Jinping, look at me, look how loud I can be about how bad the United States is. And that drum is continuous from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They have, you know, several loud outlets. The Global Times is one that just kind of always going on that same line, but you see it less from the diplomats in times like this.
Tyler, if I could ask another question. Historians are now saying such things as the pivot to Asia was Obama's biggest mistake, and leaving the Middle East and Afghanistan and all of these in our own backyard, sort of in turmoil, and at the same time not really making things more peaceful in Asia. So are you in agreement with that kind of a more global idea as to where the United States should direct its attention?
Well, I think the U.S. looks at itself as an Indo-Pacific power. I mean, this region is going to be the economic driver of the world economy. The Middle East, the petrochemical, extractive industry is dying. Even Middle Eastern states know that. Petrostates are trying to get out of the gas business because it's, there is an expiration date on that. Having spent a fair bit of time in and around the Middle East, am I sad that we have a less significant presence there? No, I'm not. I was in favor of a withdrawal from Afghanistan. I wasn't particularly happy with the plan or the execution, which spanned administrations. But do I think we had many goals left that we could achieve there? Probably not. The Taliban was resurgent. We were getting smaller. We built a corrupt country with a military that unfortunately relied on U.S. support, and then we withdrew that support and kind of collapsed that house of cards. But we also, we built a government that wasn't able to lead, because it was, rotten, effectively. We can't invest all of our defense capability in Europe. We obviously have huge commitments there as part of NATO and a leader in European security. But no, I agree. I still think the pivot was right. It probably wasn't enough. I don't think more U.S. presence is what's causing friction in Asia. I think a rising country that insists on its right to seize neighbors' territory is probably the bigger problem. If you can name kind of an organization where the PRC has acted in good faith in the last 20 years, it'd be a pretty small list.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
But
It's just interesting that these are the comments that are now being made by the historians of the world. Yeah.
I think that the end of that history hasn't been written yet, so I guess we'll see.
Oh,
Blake, up in the top right-hand corner of my screen, I see a partial title, Carrier Killer. And so could you tell us in a little bit more detail why I think you doubt that those carrier killer missile capabilities are quite as powerful as the Chinese would claim? I think I read some comments on your book, and there are some flaws in their technology, I guess.
Yeah, there's a model back there as well. It's a little harder to see, but there's a model DF-21 back there. Also, the anti-ship ballistic missile program that China has is effectively untested at sea against moving targets, and they keep it that way, which to me says this isn't a missile they can count on to work the way they think it should, with the degree of fidelity they'd need to rely on it. Hitting targets on land, that's pretty easy. Most countries have been able to do that since the early Cold War. We saw Iran use ballistic missiles against Iraq, against US forces in Iraq. That's not very hard. That's math and decent production capability. But hitting a moving target at sea is actually quite hard. We've seen them try one shot at sea against a moving target and then go back to testing on land, which again tells me it didn't work. And we're seeing kind of the DF-21 has sort of stopped production. So they've now moved on to the DF-26, which is a larger missile that's also hot swappable, which creates kind of a big issue. So hot swappable meaning that they can change the warhead in the field from a nuclear warhead to a conventional one. Which creates a big problem for targeting them, because if you're targeting something that you think is a conventional weapon, but your enemy knows is a nuclear weapon, you've now, you've pushed them into that use-lose dilemma without even knowing it. So we could see, that's an area where Beijing has created an incredible escalation, incredible potential for escalation. Which again, this is why the US and Russia had arms control agreements. No one wants to see this kind of thing happen. But again, Beijing refuses to engage in arms control discussions. They say, no, we don't want to do that. We see them weaponizing things like hotlines they don't answer the phone when there's a crisis because they want to use that crisis to their advantage. And so in that way, we have a totally different paradigm from the Cold War, in that at least in the Cold War, most of the time we had two parties that were pretty interested in not turning, our two countries into sheets of glass. China has tried to kind of skate along, being treated as a developing country without acting like an actual responsible, mature power. So it's a tough problem for Washington to get their arms around.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I gather in the balloon gate issue that we experienced a month or so ago, or 2 months ago, that the hotline did not work. I read that someplace, where we called them and said, "Okay, guys, let's talk about this," and nobody picked up. Was that purposeful, I guess, or just we're not going to talk about it?
It's hard to know, because there's the CCP is so top-down oriented. No one has any authority to do anything or to say anything if they're not Xi Jinping. And if he's not getting on the phone, no one else can really tell you anything. So if you look at the 2001 collision between the J-8 fighter and the American EP-3, where an American EP-3 landed on Hainan Island, we were calling the Chinese and they're not answering. And at the time, we didn't know, are they not answering because they don't know what to do, or because they're trying to keep us in the dark?
Yeah.
And I think now we know that one was because they didn't know what to do. They honestly didn't see that. They didn't think that was going to happen, and it did, and they were paralyzed. And so today we still have to ask the same question, like, do they not know what to do? Are they trying to take advantage? And that, that creates a dilemma for Washington, because they have to decide how to respond to that. With the balloon, I think it probably came down to, like, they thought they weren't going to get caught, and they were embarrassed, and then they were publicly humiliated because we, saw it, tracked it, then shot it down, which is why you then saw that pivot back to, like, very aggressive messaging from Beijing, for conciliatory for a day or two. We regret the incident, et cetera, et cetera. But then, the United States has been so aggressive and irresponsibly used force against a peaceable weather balloon. And unfortunately, we kind of lost the spin battle eventually, even though we were in a very, very strong position up front. So yeah, Beijing's weaponization of these things is a huge problem. We've heard a number of defense officials complain about that in the last year or two. Lloyd Austin couldn't get his counterpart to answer the phone because Beijing didn't agree that person was his counterpart. They said it was someone else, and they wouldn't pick up the phone. So,
wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do you say we lost the spin battle with the balloon? I mean, we did ascertain that they were transmitting electronic info back home, right? So,
Yep.
Okay.
Well, I think they eventually Beijing just kind of was running with a narrative that we used force and it didn't need to happen, and this, that, and the other. And this was something that was so easy to shut down from the beginning. Like, no, this was a clear violation of U.S. sovereignty. It was blown off course due to force majeure. Okay, well, if you knew that, why didn't you tell us? Like, if that's true, you should have told us a week ago.
Mm-hmm.
That's the responsible thing to do. And that was an easy public shutdown. Like, nope, this is not true, because if that was true, you would have told us. And if you didn't, then you're not fit to lead a region, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
If that's how you operate, and instead we kind of hemmed and hawed, and then we started hearing leaks about, oh, well, some of the generals don't agree that we should have shot it down earlier, and then it kind of turned into this inward-looking DC debate about the balloon, and then China just kind of kept repeating, the U.S. used so much force against a balloon, and just, unfortunately, I don't know, we had some easy options up front to use, and we didn't.
Yeah.
Do you think so?
I think it was
for instance,
interesting. Go ahead, June. Yeah.
Well, I guess in a situation such as that, and as many, I find the fact that, the U.S. has, as an open community, right, this ability to sort of speak all sorts of different points of view, but it's very confusing, I think, to the public as to, because many times it's experts who are speaking who are in disagreement. versus one voice that is coming out of China. So I think to people who are not clear as to who they should be following, it's a very confusing situation that makes the US look as though they don't know what they're doing.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, that's, I guess you have, for us, we look at it as a feature, not a bug, right? That our democracy is loud and messy, and, frequently we disagree, and you can kind of choose who you want to listen to. And, obviously the Chinese don't have that luxury. They can listen to one person and there's one correct opinion, and, you can share it or you can go away. Right. So that's, yeah, that's one of those things that I think we've always probably had that same issue, right? That's, it can be hard to get the whole country going in one direction.
Yeah.
But I think it's more
really loud
serious.
and rambunctious.
But then you have, our representatives in Congress who are also listening to this. So, I wonder if we're always acting in our own public interests by, having all these diverse views, rather than that frequently may be affecting the policy decisions that our administration is making that may or may not be in our best interests.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, that's just sort of one of those baked in things with democracy. It's, I believe that it's a good way for us to govern ourselves, but there is a good book, actually, I'm reading at the moment by a friend of mine, Charles Dunst, called Defeating the Dictators. And he sort of gets at your point there, June, that, are we disadvantaged vis-a-vis states that don't have to worry about kind of this multiplicity of opinions, or that are directed by one, great helmsman. And his thesis is that we are, but only in so much as we allow ourselves to be, because we have it in ourselves to govern well. For a long time we did, but in a situation where peoples are losing faith in our system, or the parts of our government or in public services, that's because we're not governing well. And that's on those same legislators and the president to, build a country and keep institutions healthy and revive people's faith in the American experiment. We're continually reinventing ourselves. I think that's a strength that we have. We've done it before, and we're probably going to have to do it again.
Blake, a quick question. Former President Ma, was on an extended trip to China. What is he talking about with the folks he's meeting with? Do you view this as a positive, or just does the KMT really eager to make friends back in China, or what's going on there?
Oh, I mean, what's he talking about? I couldn't say what's going on behind closed doors, but the KMT is traditionally, the party of positive ties with Beijing. They have said in this election that you're either voting for war or peace. That's how they're framing the 2024 presidential election. You're either voting for a war or for peace. We will give you peace across the strait. That's what the KMT is promising. Now, how that is reconciled with a Taiwan that overwhelmingly and increasingly views itself as Taiwanese and not Chinese, even among KMT voters. Even KMT voters are not interested in like a one country, two systems. They see themselves not as Chinese, but as Taiwanese. So that complicates things for the KMT, because how close can they get to Beijing before they start running afoul of kind of the zeitgeist in Taiwan, which does not want to be Chinese.
Yeah. One last question, and I think, boy, you're probably getting foggy-eyed there, ready to hit the hay. But one last question, and this is a lighter, well, maybe not a lighter subject actually, but you wrote a piece for USA Today talking about Elon Musk as a threat to our national security. a little bit exaggerated maybe, but what was the gist of that?
Well, so there's, if you kind of look at the increasing exposure of Mr. Musk's companies to U.S. national security, to include, Starlink, the idea of rocket logistics through SpaceX, or any other number of potential projects. You're also dealing with an actor that is extremely leveraged in China, that is deepening investment in China at a time when the US government is actually encouraging industries to do the opposite. He is the benefactor of extreme subsidy from the CCP. His businesses are intertwined with Belt and Road projects to include nickel mining in Indonesia. So when you have someone who is effectively, developing their own foreign policy, like he certainly has very strong views on Ukraine. After kind of getting the Ukrainians reliant on Starlink, he then decided how they could and could not use that militarily, despite it being paid for by the US government. How do you, having spent a lot of time in the US intelligence community, there are a lot of things there that we would traditionally view as, red flags for conduct and behavior. A normal person would be investigated and probably lose a security clearance over that kind of thing. And instead, we are stumbling over ourselves to give him billions more of our own defense dollars to develop new projects. And this is, again, a guy who only several weeks ago was warned publicly by the Global Times, like that he was biting the hand that feeds, breaking the jar of China. Hey, does Mr. Musk remember that he has his, gigafactory here in Shanghai? Does he remember that he's trying to build a new battery factory here?
Yeah.
Those are alarming things to hear about a person who is deeply enmeshed in U.S. national security and in our information space, with his social media acquisition.
Yeah. And sometimes you do have to wonder about his mental stability a little bit. Anyway, that's a whole different story. But, well, listen, Blake, thank you very much. I know it's late in Singapore. We appreciate your time. And that was a great summary of what's going on over there. So thank you again. And maybe we can do it sometime in the far future. So.
Or not too far.
Not too far. Yeah, well, not too far. Yeah.
I'm sure
month.
there's
How about
always
next
going to be
month?
something that comes up, right? That we're going to want to have Blake on speed dial for.
Yeah.
So
thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah.
No, Blake, thank you. So we will see our audience in 2 weeks on Monday, April 24th. And we've got another very good program. This one's going to be on Latin America. We haven't really looked at Latin America, but there's a lot that's going on our southern border, and we will want to tune in. Our speaker will be Cynthia McClintock. She's a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University, and director of the GW Latin American his hemispheric studies program. With violence, poverty, instability, climate change facing much of Latin America, there are challenges, democracy and stability right on our border. So stay tuned, join us in 2 weeks. And again, Blake, thank you.
Thanks again, Blake. Yep.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you all
Thanks.
for
Take care,
coming.
everyone.
And again,
Okay.
Blake, thank you, and June and Tyler and Don for all their help in getting this program together. Hope to see you at all our programs at the library. Please go to our website, chappaqua.library.org. Thank you again. Bye, everyone.